download our Revise It Right revision app for hundreds of videos, quizzes, exam questions, tutor support and so much more. This video is about cell differentiation and specialisation. Now, differentiation is the process where an unspecialised cell turns into a specialised cell. Now, an unspecialised cell is a cell that does not have a function. So it doesn't have a job, it doesn't have a role, it doesn't have a function. Whereas a specialised cell is a cell that does have a function. It does have a role, it does have a job. And we're going to be looking at examples of those cells in a second. Okay, so a specialised cell is a cell that is adapted to do a particular function. Now, most differentiation happens in animals as it is developing. It is mainly used for growth and repair. So when an organism is very young at an early stage, their cells are differentiating for growth. Whereas when an organism becomes an adult and it no longer grows, differentiation is then mostly used for repair, so repairing damaged cells. A lot of plant cells, however, do not lose their ability to differentiate, and this means they can keep differentiating throughout their whole life. Okay, so they can become one cell to another cell to another cell. So they don't lose that ability to differentiate. Now, as I just said, we're going to look at some examples of different specialised cells, and we're going to look at some specialised animal cells first. We're going to start with one that most people have heard of and most people remember, and that is a sperm cell. So I'm going to try my best at drawing a sperm cell for you now. Okay, it looks more like a spoon, but this is a sperm cell. Okay, now what we need to remember with both of these is the function, and when I say function, I'm talking about what it actually does. So what it actually does. And also you need to learn some adaptations. Now the important thing with adaptations is what that cell actually has that other cells don't have to make it good at what it does. So what adaptations does that cell have that makes it good and efficient at the function it has? Okay, so we know hopefully that the function of the sperm is to fertilise the egg. Okay, we can take that even deeper to say that actually it's to mix or combine the male DNA to the female DNA. Okay, and that's really, really important, and if that didn't happen, none of us would be here. So what adaptations does it actually have to make it good at that? Well, one of them is quite obvious, is that it has a tail. Now, if it didn't have this tail, it wouldn't be able to swim. So the importance of the tail is to swim to the egg. Now, if it couldn't swim, it couldn't go anywhere, it couldn't get to the egg, so we would have died out as a species. Animals would have died out. So very important that sperm has a tail. Also, within the sperm, there are lots of mitochondria. Now, if you think this sperm has got to do a lot of swimming, it's got to travel a long distance, therefore it's going to need lots of energy. And we'll remember from a previous video that mitochondria is where aerobic respiration happens, which provides energy. So it needs lots of mitochondria to provide lots of energy for its journey to the egg. And finally, if we go over to the head of the sperm, well, I'll do it from this way. It contains an enzyme which can break down the egg. Okay, so the head of the sperm contains an enzyme which can help to break down the egg. Now, we will look at enzymes in a future video, but for now, we need to know that it's an enzyme, contains an enzyme that breaks down the egg. So lots of adaptations that we need to remember there, 1, 2, and 3, but we also need to remember the function. So now we're going to look at nerve cells. Now, nerve cells are very, very important cells, as really they all are. Again, I'm going to again try my best to draw a nerve cell for you now, and hopefully you would recognise this from school, learning about it. Now the function of a nerve cell is to send electrical signals around the body. Okay, so if you get a question, write it that way. Carry electrical signals around the body. Okay, now why that's important is because it allows us all to respond to our environment. Okay, if we didn't have nerve cells, first of all, really we'd just be a blob on the floor, but we wouldn't be able to do anything. We wouldn't be able to respond to everything. They carry electrical signals around the body very, very quickly. Now it contains, again, some adaptations that make it good at its job, and hopefully you can see just by looking at it that it's different to the sperm cell. Therefore it has different structures that make it good for its role. Okay, that's what we mean by adaptations. Now the first is it contains these things here. Now we can call these dendrites. Okay, so it contains dendrites. That's the first adaptation. Okay, now these dendrites connect to other nerve cells to carry on the electrical impulse. Okay, so if I were to draw it, I'd go draw another nerve cell, a very small one, but another nerve cell here, and you can see that dendrite is connecting to the other nerve cell to allow that signal to carry on. And that's very, very important. The nerve cell also contains something called myelin sheath. Okay, and I'll write that here, myelin sheath. Now, why myelin sheath is important is because it speeds up the impulse, the electrical signal. It speeds it up, it makes it go quicker. That's obviously very, very useful, so we can respond to our environment much, much quicker. Okay, so dendrites, myelin sheath. And also a third adaptation is that they are long. And really they contain something called a long axon. Now the axon is this bit here I'm highlighting. Okay, this part here. Okay, that's important. Okay, so the long axon is really, really important to travel. So it's long to cover a long distance in our body. Okay, to get that electrical impulse to travel much, much further. So the function is to carry electrical signals around the body. The adaptations that it contains dendrites to connect to other nerve cells. It contains myelin sheath that speed up the impulse or the electrical signal. And also it's long, it has a long axon to cover long distances across our body. The final animal specialised cell that we're going to learn about is muscle cells. Okay, now muscle cells are quite harder to draw. So I'm going to draw sort of a group of muscle cells. Now, so we call this muscle tissue. Okay, now we will look at what we mean by tissue in a future video. So here we've got a group of muscle cells. Now the function of our muscle cells is to contract to allow for movement. So to contract to allow for movement. Okay, now this is obviously you have muscle connected to our bones which allow our bones to move, but you also have muscle tissue found in some organs. For example, the stomach. So the stomach walls can move to churn up food. Okay, so muscle cells are all about movement. Now, some adaptations that you need to be aware about for muscle cells. Okay, one is that they contain lots of mitochondria, just like we did with our sperm cell. Again, for the same reason, for lots of energy. Muscle cells have sometimes got to do lots of movement, therefore they're going to need lots of energy to do this. So lots of mitochondria to provide lots of energy. That's one adaptation. Okay. Number two is that they have space or gaps. You can see here they have gaps around them. Okay. Now this allows the space to contract. Okay, so these gaps allow space around the muscle cells in order to contract for movement. So the gaps allow space to contract. And three, you can see here they're long and thin. So a third adaptation is that they are long and thin. And again, this just allows or gives them space to contract. Okay, so we've got our function, which is to contract to allow for movement. And then we've got three adaptations, so lots of mitochondria to provide energy. Gaps, which allow the space to contract, and they're also long and thin, which again allows them and gives them space in order to contract. Remember to download our Revise It Right revision app, watch over 700 videos, answer 4,000 plus quiz questions, over 1,000 flashcards, 1,000 exam questions, worksheets, forums, and get help from qualified teachers, and so much more. The link is in the description. Now what I'd like you to do now is to pause the video here and to have a go at answering these questions, and then we'll go through the answers. Okay, so hopefully you've got the answers for these questions. First of all, why does the nerve cell have lots of dendrites? Well, we said the purpose of the dendrites was to connect to other neurons or other nerve cells. So that would be the answer here, to connect to other nerve cells. What is a specialised cell? Well, we said that it's a cell that is adapted to have a particular function. Okay, so a specialised cell is a cell that is adapted to have a particular function. What is the function of the cell membrane? This is a bit of a throwback to a previous video. If you remember, the function of the cell membrane is to control what can enter and leave. Number 4, what do we mean by differentiate? Well, differentiate is the process where an unspecialised cell turns into a specialised cell. So that could be an unspecialised cell turning into a sperm cell, for example, or an unspecialised cell turning into a muscle cell. What is the function of the nucleus? Well, that was from a previous video. It contains the genetic material and it controls the cell. What do ribosomes do? That's where protein is made in the cell. What is the function of a nerve cell? Well, the nerve cell carries electrical impulses around the body. So carries electrical impulses around the body. And number 8, give 2 adaptations of a nerve cell. Well, we learnt about 3, so any of those will be great. So number 1, they have dendrites. Number 2, they contain myelin sheath. And number 3, they have a long axon. So we've learned about 3 types of specialised animal cells there. Now we need to learn about different examples of specialised plant cells. And the first we're going to look at is a root hair cell. So I'm going to draw one for you now, and as I draw it you might recognise this from school. So here is what a root hair cell looks like, with a rather large vacuole. Now the function of a root hair cell is to absorb mineral ions and water from the soil. Okay, so absorb mineral ions and water from the soil. Now, it contains different adaptations to do this function. So the first of it, it contains a large surface area. Okay, this part here, this hair-like structure here, provides it with a much larger surface area. Number 2, it contains no chloroplast. Okay, if you remember, the function of the chloroplast is where photosynthesis happens. Now, if you think that these root hair cells are found in the roots and the soil, they're not going to get any light down there, and therefore no photosynthesis is going to take place. So they don't need any chloroplast. Now, this allows the vacuole to be much larger, as it doesn't have to have any chloroplast, so it can have a much larger vacuole. And number 3, it contains lots of mitochondria. Okay, so lots of mitochondria. Again, Mitochondria is where aerobic respiration takes place to provide energy. We move mineral ions into the root hair cell by something called active transport. Now, don't worry if you don't remember what this is, as we will look into this in a future video. But for now, you need to be aware that active transport requires energy. So to do this, you're going to need lots of mitochondria. Okay, so the function is to absorb mineral ions and water from the soil into the plant. Okay, and the adaptation is it has a large surface area, it contains no chloroplasts, and it contains lots of mitochondria. So now we're going to look at the xylem cell. Okay, so the xylem and the xylem cell transports water up the plant. Okay, so the function of the xylem and the xylem cells is to transport water up the plant. So that water would come from the roots, from the root hair cells, up the xylem, and then go into the leaves where it could be used for photosynthesis. But for now, the function of the xylem is to transport water up the plant. Okay. Now, what you'll notice when you look at the xylem cell is that they have stacked on top of each other to form a tube shape. Okay, so one adaptation, of the xylem cell is that they have formed a tube shape. This makes it much more efficient to transport water. Number two, you might also notice when you look at it that it contains no organelles. So when we talk about organelles, of course, we're referring to the mitochondria, the chloroplasts, the ribosomes. Our xylem cell contains no organelles. And this just means that the water can easily flow through the xylem. Okay, so no organelles, so water can easily flow through the xylem. Okay, and a third adaptation is that it's strengthened by something called lignin. Okay, so this just strengthens the xylem and allows it to stand up and stay up straight. So the lignin provides strength to the xylem. So the function is to transport water up the plant. The adaptations that they form a tube shape, contains no organelles, and it's strengthened by lignin. Now the phloem cell, we can also draw this very similar because it also forms a tube shape. Okay, however, it's slightly different is I'm drawing these here, and I'll tell you what these here in a second. But the phloem cell, the function is to transport glucose around the plant. Okay, so glucose obviously made in photosynthesis in the leaves. It then needs to get around the plant to be used for respiration. So in order to be transported around this plant, it goes through the phloem, or the phloem cells. So the function is to transport glucose around the plant. Now adaptations, again we can take an adaptation from the xylem cell, is that they form tube. It forms a tube shape. Again, this just makes it easier and more efficient to transport sugar around the plant, glucose around the plant. Number two, they contain these here. As you can see, it's not just a straight gap, but it's more like sieve plates, as we call it. So the end of the cells form sieve plates. Okay, so that's a second adaptation. Again, this just allows for glucose to be moved up and down the phloem. Okay, so one adaptation that they form a tube shape. The second is that the end of the cells form sieve plates. Now the third adaptation is these here. Okay, now we call these companion cells. Okay, now just like with the xylem cell, the phloem cell contains no organelles. However, when we're dealing with moving glucose, this actually requires energy to move. This requires energy to move. Now, because of that, the phloem cell is going to need mitochondria, but it doesn't contain any organelles. So these companion cells contain lots of mitochondria to provide the energy, to provide the energy for the phloem cell to move glucose up and around the plant. Okay, now what I'd like you to do is to pause the video here and have a go at answering these 5 questions, and then we'll go through them once you've done. Okay, so we'll start with question 1. What is the function of the root hair, xylem and phloem cells? Quite a big question. So the root hair cells, you'll remember, will absorb mineral ions and water from the soil into the roots. The xylem cells transport water up the plant, and the phloem cells transport glucose around the plant. So why do root hair cells have lots of mitochondria? The answer to this question always, in terms of lots of mitochondria, is for energy, to provide lots of energy for the movement of mineral ions into the root hair cell. Remember that it requires energy by active transport. You will learn about that in a future video. What cell structure do photosynthetic cells have lots of? Okay, now this is a bit of a throwback to a previous video. Now, to answer this question, we just have to remember, well, what organelle is it? Where does photosynthesis actually happen? And for that, you'll remember that it happens in the chloroplast. Okay, so if a cell does photosynthesis, then it's going to need lots of chloroplast. So that's your answer for that one. Question 4, what is the purpose of the sieve plates? And that is just to allow glucose to move around the phloem. Okay, so up and down the phloem. And question 5, what is the name given to the type of cells that keep phloem cells alive? Okay, now you'll remember we call them companion cells. Okay, companion cells. And these contain, remember, lots of mitochondria to provide energy for the phloem cells. So you now have learnt there lots of examples of specialised cells. We learnt the definition of differentiation and then went to look at specialised animal and plant cells. Lots to remember again. You can now move on to working through the quiz and the exam questions on this topic. And just like always, if you really don't understand, then you can get into contact with one of our tutors if you are a paying member, and they will get back to you with an answer.